Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The Union Health Ministry has said that there is no evidence available to indicate community transmission of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last 2 months, we have been discussing that community transmission refers to the third stage of transmission of an infectious disease. It is said to occur when people with no travel history or no contact history start contracting the infection. See, for any infectious disease, there are different stages of transmission. Globally, there are 4 stages that have been recognized. This includes imported cases, local transmission, community transmission, and finally, the infectious disease turns into an epidemic. See, under the first stage, the infection is brought to the region by those who have traveled to another affected region. These imported cases later give rise to the second stage of transmission, that is local transmission, when they pass on the infection to their primary and secondary contacts. See, under these 2 stages, it is easier to contain the spread of the infection because the travelers can be easily screened and their primary and secondary contacts can be traced and they can be quarantined. But when a large number of cases with no travel history and no contact history start to come up, the region is said to have entered the third stage of transmission, that is community transmission. And under this stage, it becomes harder to trace the source of the infection and hence the spread of the infection becomes harder to contain. The failure to contain community transmission gives rise to the 4th stage of transmission, and this is when it turns into a full-blown epidemic and it becomes almost impossible to contain its spread. Since the COVID-19 outbreak began in India, the Health Ministry and the Indian Council of Medical Research have consistently maintained that the spread of COVID-19 has been limited to the first 2 stages of transmission. They have also consistently maintained that there is no evidence available to indicate the beginning of community transmission. Just recently, the government acknowledged that India might be in between local transmission and community transmission by designating a new stage of transmission known as large outbreaks that can be contained, which basically refers to the emergence of clusters. The emergence of clusters at Bhilwara, Dharavi, at the Nizamuddin Markaz in Delhi has led the government to give utmost priority to contain the spread of these clusters through aggressive containment, contact tracing and testing strategies, which is being referred to as a total seal down or also as the Bhilwara model. Such an aggressive strategy is being followed to contain the spread of these clusters because the failure to contain the spread of these clusters will result in community transmission. So by focusing on cluster containment, the government has repeatedly denied that community transmission has begun in India. But the biggest criticism against the government of India and the ICMR is that adequate testing is not being carried out in the country to detect community transmission. Epidemiologists, medical experts, and even the WHO have said that community transmission can be detected only through widespread testing. In response to this criticism, the ICMR has said that indiscriminate testing is not the right strategy for India. This testing strategy of ICMR is also based on the fact that India unfortunately doesn't have adequate testing kits and testing laboratories. But in order to address these concerns about community transmission having already begun, the ICMR began an exercise in mid-March. Through this exercise, the ICMR started randomly testing patients who were suffering with severe acute respiratory illness such as pneumonia for possibly being infected with COVID-19. This random testing exercise would help reveal whether patients admitted with severe acute respiratory illness have actually been suffering from COVID-19. Over the last 1 month, around 6,000 such random tests have been done on patients who were admitted with severe acute respiratory illness across the country. And this exercise has found that around 104 of these patients were actually infected with COVID-19. This means that the patient and the doctors treating them were not aware that he was a COVID-19 patient. This also indicates that most of these 104 patients did not have a travel history and they did not have any contact history as well. Between March 21st and April 2nd alone, this random testing exercise has identified around 40 cases who had no travel history or no contact history. So this is a possible indicator that community transmission might have already begun in India. Even a few state governments have said that they've come across a few cases who had no travel history or contact history, indicating possible community transmission. But despite this, the Health Ministry has said that there is no evidence of community transmission, primarily because these numbers are still very low. That's the reason why the Health Ministry has been saying that India is currently in between local transmission and community transmission, and it has designated this stage as large outbreaks that can be contained, and hence the primary focus is on the containment of these clusters. Now let's take up the next article. The Department of Pharmaceuticals, which is under the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers, has warned the Ministry of Home Affairs that the country could be facing an imminent shortage of drugs and medical equipment due to the lockdown. Similar concerns have been expressed by the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority as well, which is a regulatory agency under the Department of Pharmaceuticals that is responsible for regulating the prices of drugs. See, even though drug manufacturers and the medical industry have been exempted from the lockdown as they produce essential commodities, they have been able to function only at 20 to 30% of their capacity. This is primarily because the exemption is not being reflected at the ground level. This has created a shortage of labor, disruption of transportation and logistics, mistreatment at the hands of local officials, and the non-availability of packaging material and raw material. It is not just the reverse migration of daily wage laborers which is creating a shortage of manpower. Even regular full-time workers are not able to turn up to work because they are either facing harassment at the hands of the local police and local officials, or they are facing pressure from their families and their local communities. Then the lockdown has disrupted the movement of trucks and logistics such as courier services, and it has affected even essential services such as the manufacturers of drugs and medical equipment. So the possibility of being harassed by the police and the local officials and the shutting down of related industries and suppliers has disrupted the availability of packaging material and raw material as well. So these factors have significantly brought down production in factories that manufacture drugs and medical equipment. And these concerns have been flagged by the Department of Pharmaceuticals. Then upon this, India being a major hub for drugs and medical equipment, nearly 50% of its output is being exported as they fetch better prices. So the decline in production and the export of available stock could result in an imminent shortage of drugs and medical devices in the domestic market, and these concerns have been raised by the Department of Pharmaceuticals with the Ministry of Home Affairs. Now let's take up the next article. The Indian Army has launched a massive attack against the gun positions of the Pakistani Army and the terror launchpads that are located across the border by using heavy weaponry such as artillery guns. India has said that this attack is a retaliation against Pakistan's repeated violation of the ceasefire in order to provide a cover to the terrorists who are trying to infiltrate across the border into India. The heavy shelling and gunfight in the area has affected the local villagers residing near the border, and they have been forced to evacuate to safer places at a time when they were supposed to be staying at home during this lockdown period. Even though the whole world is coming together to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, Pakistan seems to be exploiting this opportunity to further promote infiltration and terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6 referring to community transmission and the random testing of patients suffering from severe acute respiratory illness by the ICMR. But we have already covered this topic at the start of the session, so I would request you to go through this editorial once. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6. See, the biggest challenge created by the COVID-19 pandemic is that there are no other options available to us apart from imposing weeks and months of lockdown in order to slow down its spread. The decision to impose such a lockdown presents a huge dilemma for any government. because the question is about saving lives versus avoiding an economic catastrophe. Rightfully, most governments, including the Indian government, has chosen to save lives by imposing a strict lockdown even at the cost of suffering severe economic consequences. In order to overcome this economic crisis and provide support to the lower sections and the industry, the government and the RBI have come out with a couple of measures. The government has announced an economic relief package amounting to around 1.7 lakh crore rupees, and the RBI has announced a moratorium on loan repayments and has eased liquidity in order to reduce the burden on the borrowers and support the industry. But the editorial says that these measures are clearly not sufficient because the relief package announced by the government hardly accounts for 1% of India's GDP. So if India has to overcome this economic catastrophe, there is an urgent need for a second economic relief package, not only to save livelihoods, but also to save lives. Because the economic crisis might very well end up killing more people than the pandemic itself. In fact, significant pressure is being exerted by the industry as well for more support from the government. So in this context, the editorial says that it is time for the government to move away from its fiscal conservatism and forget its FRBM targets for the time being. Without being concerned about its fiscal deficit targets, it is time for the government to print more money and drastically increase government spending. The editorial says that a relief package amounting to at least 5% of India's GDP should be provided in order to support the lower sections and as well as the industry. In fact, this is what is being done by countries such as the United States and European countries. The US has approved a $2 trillion economic package. The European countries have come out with more than 100 billion euro packages on their own, and recently the European Union has also finalized a 500 billion euro package. In comparison, India's relief package of 1.7 lakh crore rupees is insignificant, and that's the reason why economic experts have been calling upon the Indian government to come out with a relief package that is in the range of 10 to 20% of India's GDP. Such a massive economic stimulus can help provide for more cash transfers to the weaker sections. It can provide more free rations, cooking gas, etc. It can help the government to provide free logistical support to the farmers in order to harvest their crops and transport them to the markets. Then the editorial also suggests that the government and the RBI could allow banks and NBFCs to reschedule and restructure the loans in order to reduce the pressure on the borrowers. Because the current moratorium provided by the RBI only defers the loan repayment and it does not essentially reduce the long-term burden on the borrowers. For this purpose, the government could consider establishing a credit guarantee fund which could cover for those who default on their loan repayments. Then the government should also consider suspending the insolvency and bankruptcy code temporarily, at least for the MSME sector. Because the economic crisis is going to sink a number of small businesses, and instead of resolving and winding them up under the IBC code, these small enterprises should be given an opportunity to resume their business with government support. Then the editorial also suggests that the government could consider providing a GST holiday for the industry, especially for the small enterprises. Such drastic measures will definitely result in significant loss of revenue to the government, and it will significantly increase government expenditure. But this is the only short way of reviving the economy that has been brought to a standstill by the pandemic. These measures will not only extend support to the weaker sections, but it will also help in reviving small businesses. It will also help in easing the movement of cash and as well as in sustaining demand, which is very much needed to revive a declining economy. As it is being said, this is an unprecedented crisis in the history of mankind, and it definitely deserves an unprecedented solution. So if we have to overcome this economic catastrophe, then we need quick and generous support from the government. Now let's take up the practice questions. In which region do we come across the buras or village elders who have been authorized by the government to act as assistants to deputy commissioners in a village administration and have been playing a vital role in governance since British India. The correct answer to this question is option D. Gaon buras are appointed by the local administration in the hilly areas of the northeast of India. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 1, Gaon buras are appointed by the local administration in several northeastern states in order to assist the district administration for improving governance at the village level. These Gaon buras are appointed under the Assam Frontier Regulation of 1945. Since the Gaon buras are elderly people, they are widely respected in the local community and hence they can help the local administration in promoting awareness, in enforcing laws, and in promoting behavioral and attitudinal change amongst the younger population. In this image, you can see the Gaon buras in Arunachal Pradesh assisting the local administration in setting up a barricade in order to enforce the lockdown. In Nagaland, Gaon buras are assisted by another set of local officials known as the Dobashis, who are seen as the custodians of Naga culture. These Dobashis, who wear red coats, they were first appointed by the British government in order to act as translators for interpreting the Naga dialects into other languages such as Assamese or Hindi. So during the current lockdown, the district administration in the northeastern states are making use of Gaon buras and Dobashis in order to enforce the lockdown. Now let's take up the second practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? Durbar move is the name given to the biannual shift of the Secretariat and all government offices of Jammu and Kashmir from one capital city to another. From May to October, governmental offices are housed in the J&K summer capital, which is Srinagar, and the other 6 months in its winter capital, that is Jammu. This practice was introduced by the British government in 1872. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, because Durbar move was introduced by the Dogra Rulers and not by the British government. Interestingly, in 1987, the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had asked the then Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Farooq Abdullah, to stop the practice of Durbar move. But the practice was continued because it acts as a bridge between the diverse culture of the Jammu region and the Kashmir Valley. So the correct answer is option B, 1 and 2 only. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 4, this year's Durbar move has been cancelled due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is the first time that the practice has been cancelled in the last 144 years. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Chicago Convention established the International Civil Aviation Organization as a specialized agency of the UN. The Bureau of Civil Aviation Security within the Ministry of Civil Aviation is responsible for regulating civil aviation security in India. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the Bureau of Civil Aviation Security has extended the validity of certifications that are given to pilots, crew, ground staff, as they won't be able to extend their certifications during the lockdown period. But please do not confuse the mandate of the Bureau of Civil Aviation for Security with the mandate of the Directorate General of Civil Aviation that we discussed the other day. See, the DGCA, which is also a part of the Ministry of Civil Aviation, acts as the regulator for civil aviation safety. It comes out with standards for airworthiness, it enforces the standards related to aviation safety, and it also investigates air accidents. Whereas the Bureau of Civil Aviation Security acts as the regulator for civil aviation security. It comes out with standards and guidelines to prevent terror attacks, hijacks, and other crimes involving civil aviation. And both these organizations are bound by the norms of the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a specialized agency of the UN that was set up through the Chicago Convention. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. Recently, which of the following states has explored the possibility of constructing an artificial inland port to be connected to sea by a long navigational channel? The correct answer is option D, Rajasthan. Because in 2015, Rajasthan had proposed to build an inland port at Jalore, which is a district in Rajasthan to connect with the Arabian Sea through inland navigation in order to facilitate the movement of minerals. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, evaluate the strategy of the ICMR behind the random testing of patients who exhibited severe acute respiratory illness during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second question, discuss the challenges faced by the drugs, pharma and medical industries during the COVID-19 lockdown. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post them in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.